this talk's called Scaling Care, and it's an attempt to kind of look at some of the structures inside of management and organizations as they have changing and what we can learn about them. So we'll start with writing software is hard. And it's hard let's talk a little bit about why it is hard to set the scene for the rest of the talk. So working with subject matter experts is to understand prior art. So whether it's development or design or inside of software, oftentimes we're automating or innovating on top of a different industry itself. So we're not innovating most of the time in software, we're innovating insurance, for example. And so we have to understand, if we're building a new way of quoting insurance, we have to understand not just the vehicle mechanisms of software itself, but we have to understand the actual actuary tables behind it enough to build things out. We have high collaborations with complementary disciplines. So this isn't a division of labor, throw it over the fence to the next part of the assembly line discipline. We actually work really closely with whether it's data science, development, design. And so we have to know enough about those other disciplines to be able to collaborate feedback loops and be able to hand off our work, because it takes all of them moving together to really build a software product. We have rapidly changing skill sets with technology advancements, and not just in the language and the mediums we use, like programming languages, but also the technologies themselves. We see very different set of data tools. We see things like blockchain coming out. And so we just have an enormous amount of things that we have to learn and we have to adapt to all the time. And the problem is always changing on us. That the new business lore is that instead of having a hypothesis and spending a bunch of money and going after it, customer development and Eric Ries has made popular this idea of pivoting. And so what it means is that we have to constantly be changing to adapt to the pivots of a business environment and the learning. That's very positive for them, but it can be very difficult, obviously, for the people who have to make those changes. So we end up, to adapt to how this work exists, we end up working in cross-functional teams. We have designers, developers, project managers, data scientists, product people, all of them working together in a very tightly knit group so that the informal communication can help leak understanding across each other, and the explicit communications can really describe the problem using a different lens or a different style. We're constantly researching the problem, whether this is more formal UX user research or a spike from a developer to like figure out if a path is the right thing. We're constantly trying to understand more about the problem, because usually, even though we're building something, we don't always understand all of the elements of the problem up front. A lot of that comes through the process. And along with that, the building process has learning and iterating. This is agile development and lean, and all of the process heavy parts of software are really built on top of this idea that this isn't a completed thing. We are learning and we are iterating along the way. So before we jump into, if we have if we know a little bit about the work that needs to be completed right in the world of software right now, I want to go into a kind of a brief history of management. And some of this is based on, or not some of this is very much inspired on Matthew Stewart's work and a lot of the things that I learned in my MBA. So first, we're going to start with kind of the beginning of management as a discipline. I can promise you that this is a brief history, so we will fast forward. But let's start with Frederick Wilson Taylor, who had the insight that planning and doing are the key functions of industry. In the early 1900s, that was a brilliant insight. And what made him famous was this pig iron experiment. And so these things that you see here are part of the steel making process. They're called pig irons. And he went to a steel company, Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania, and they found out that the part of manufacturing that was the most constrained was literally picking up these pieces of steel and putting them on rail cars. And so his solution was to get a worker and start timing all of the different things that worker did. So like how many times an hour you can put a pig iron into the rail car, how long before you need to take a break, how long the workday can be before you're starting to actually hurt the productivity going into the following day. And so he did this repeatedly, taking a bunch of measurements, and he came up with this idea of scientific management. And so his insight is it's only through enforced standards of methods, enforced adoption of the best implements and working condition, and enforced cooperation that this faster work can be assured. In a duty of enforcing the adoption of standards and enforcing the cooperation rests with management alone. And so he took this one concept of the person who was picking up the pig iron and putting it into the rail car, and he separated it into a planner and a doer. And so there's somebody who's observing what the best ways of picking this up are, and telling the individual doer exactly when to do what. And so that doer may say, okay, I can do 5 more of them, but if the optimized time to take a break is right now, then they're told to take a break or told to keep working even though they can't keep working. And so his insight of separating these two roles is what scientific management came out of. And so this is right around the same time that Harvard Business School had started in the early 1900s. And this really caught on there because they needed some way of saying, like, how is management a discipline? How do we academically teach it? And so this gave a really satisfying way to say that management is actually a science. And some of the legacies that you probably hear of this is insights like whatever can be measured can be managed. And so it turns out like if you dig a little bit deeper in here, another quote from him is, "Our scheme does not ask for initiative in a man. We do not care for his initiative." Frederick Taylor did not have a high impression of labor. He really believed that he constantly referred to labor as oxen or condescended to them as animals. And so although there's this hypothesis of scientific management, turns out that even the story itself at Bethlehem Steel was almost completely fabricated. He hired a single Norwegian worker and extrapolated data from a couple of hours. And so all of the productivity that he then went back to Harvard Business School and wrote about was based on a couple of hours, and then saying, oh, if I project this out over the course of weeks or months. So there was really very, like the conclusion, there's very little science in here. There was no controlled experiments. There was no large data sets, but the mythology still made it inside of the curriculums of Harvard Business School. And for the most part of if you look at the last 100 years of management, what makes it into Harvard Business School makes it into the zeitgeist of management in senior organizations. So over time, this scientific management doesn't produce the results in industry that is purported. And a little bit later, there's a gentleman by the name of Elton Mayo, who had the insight of employees motivated far more by relational factors such as attention and camaraderie than by environmental factors. And so, like Frederick Wilson, he went out to kind of test this. And his subject group was, at the time, there were a bunch of relays being made. This is the 30s, where the telephone network in the United States is being built out. And they did a experiment by pulling a whole bunch of women in the factory out of the normal factory setting and letting them work in different ways, like letting them take breaks whenever they wanted, letting them socialize as part of the day, letting them get to know each other, holding birthday parties. And the idea here was that each time you considered more about the individual and you were more considerate of the things for the individual, productivity went up. And so his big insight of the Mayo management is, and he brought this back to Harvard, is advancing the idea that managers who understand the nature of informal ties among workers can make decisions for management's benefit. So this is he has a background in psychology, and that should be unsurprising that he believed that getting into the psyche of the labor force would allow management to make more decisions to increase productivity. Well, it should be probably not a giant surprise that the Hawthorne studies, it turns out upon scrutiny, were not really experiments. They were too confounded for researchers to be able to draw any firm conclusions. They were unreplicable outside of this one factory in the western suburbs of Chicago at Western Electric. And so there's just no scrutiny behind any of these things. And so when it didn't stop it from being taught as the zeitgeist of management culture that you have to really get closer to the psychology of the individuals. And later on, it also turns out that he was hired by the Carnegie family to conduct the research with the idea of increasing productivity in their factories without having to make any investments in changing the working conditions. So the unions were coming after the Carnegies, saying that they had very poor working conditions and that's why their productivity was low. And this really was serving them to say, no, if you just care more about the psyche of the individuals on the edges, you don't have to change their actual working conditions. What we now know that came out of this is the Hawthorne studies. The big conclusion that we still have today is the Hawthorne effect, that when you measure something, it has the experiment has the ability to change the results by itself. It's called the Hawthorne effect. And it meant that every time they changed something, productivity went up, probably had more to do with the Hawthorne effect, which has been replicated since then. So now we move into, all of these are 20, 30 years apart, but now we move into out of black and white and into the next thing that management really figured out, which is Michael Porter, the insight of the most unattractive industry would be one approaching perfect competition in which available profits for all firms are driven to normal profit levels. Well, you'd say, Paul, isn't that exactly what Adam Smith's invisible hand of the markets and capitalism is based on? Well, sure enough, it is the opposite of that. And so what comes out of this is this world of strategy and competitive strategy that takes work from industrial economics, where they were studying the economics of business firms, and shows how perfect competition isn't what the markets are. And he came up with this thing called the five forces that we won't go into too much here, but like he said that there are these five forces that really change the competitive landscape. So is there a threat of new entrants? So if you have a monopoly, then your ability to be profitable is higher because there's no threat of new entrants. And strategy eventually evolved to all of these market dynamics that were moving away from perfect competition. Bruce Henderson, who started BCG, was famous for coming up with economies of scale, suggesting that every time you doubled output of something, the cost to make that next unit went down by 10%. And so a lot of these strategies are intended to create moats and stay away from the normal capitalist practice of, or the normal capitalist theory of perfect competition. And so this one is unfortunately a lot of these things in strategy are very true, but the mythology of it here is really well put by a Richard Rummel quote. If you know how to design a great motorcycle engine, I can teach you all you need to know about strategy in a few days. If you have a PhD in strategy, years of labor are unlikely to give you the ability to design a great motorcycle engine. And what I really kind of take away from this and see a lot in strategy is that strategy exploits the dynamics of a competitive marketplace to produce what Porter calls excess profits. And so it's not about creating value, it's not about innovating, but it's really how do you exploit the conditions under which you're operating in to produce the definition of excess capital, excess profits, I apologize. So we're 50, actually 75 years into management as a discipline. And really what we've seen is that it's taken the purview of the worker completely out. So care for the worker is completely gone. There are all these dynamics. The strategists are saying there are dynamics in the market at play. The Mayo management is saying that if you can change their lives on the edges just enough, that everybody will be kind of harmonious and work more. And Frederick Taylor is really saying that you can't really trust labor. You have to have somebody else who's really telling them what to do and managing all of these things. So we're going to fast forward, and I won't take you through every single thing in management theory, largely because I don't know it. But we'll fast forward here a little bit to talk about the software craft worker. And there's lots of terms. I really like the term crafter, craft work. There's knowledge work, technologists, software developer, designers, all of these things that I think that I'm creating an umbrella and naming it the version of it that I like here. But I think that all of those labels apply to what I'm about to discuss. So I think that the really interesting thing here is these disciplines that management has tried to take apart, we're actually needing to integrate the idea of labor management and strategy to be able to do our day-to-day work. We need the labor side, we need the skill set to be actually produce whatever it is, a code base. We need to be able to produce a mock-up. We need to actually be able to work with the mediums themselves. We need to be able to management. Software is a team sport. Like, even if it's not in the traditional setting of these people report to me and I report to this person, which exists, but also just management and coordinating and figuring out how to identify and communicate with those colleagues inside of the team, and strategy, that the more and more senior management isn't making these decisions on behalf of the marketplace and then everybody else is executing it. More, Henry Ford said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a better horse. And I've always found that to be a really condescending quote, and we've come so far now that we're actually asking our users, our hypothetical users, we're digging into those users and figuring out what they want and adapting that to our products. He was fortunate enough to just be on a wave of mechanics and innovation in the automotive world that he could have that kind of hubris. We don't have all that hubris in a more competitive world of SaaS businesses and software. And so we, as the individuals who are doing the user research or understanding the production support, how our users want to use the product, and make very critical decisions based on that. And that doesn't happen inside of the room of senior management anymore. That's the person who is doing the work, working inside of the team, and oftentimes making these decisions on behalf of what the product does, is all a much more integrated identity and an integrated worker than we've had, than the management theory has acknowledged. I think that the craft worker is stretched but not stressed, that we get to the place where we have to be moving in a direction to solve challenging problems, because most of the things we do haven't really been done before. And if they've been done before, it very quickly adapts and innovates into something brand new. And so I think that the idea of being stretched and intellectually curious and pushing forward is really important. It's no longer where we can be trained to do something in the beginning of our career, and we just do that for the entire career. So this concept of constantly being stretched is something that needs to exist. But we've all seen what this, we've either seen firsthand or heard the stories of what the stress with the death marches inside of SaaS, not SaaS, inside of startups are like before, and that really not only reduces quality, but increases burnout in the individual, which is worse than low quality, is actually reducing important labor from the workforce. So the next is that the craft worker experiences both generalism and specialism as stages of their career. That because it's not a division of labor and you throw it over to the next specialist, that there is a baseline of understanding that needs to be work in the front end or in software. It might be understanding both UX, user research, front end development, and if you go into a development position, it might be like understanding both the back end integrations. And so that platform of generalism will allow individuals to jump off and have the T skill set, where you go into things that are more important, and those things might go out of style and need to go into a new specialist just by the pace of the industry. And so I think there's something very special about not just following a career path that narrows as you move up the ladder, that the craft work career can go in many different directions. So if we talk about a little bit about what the labor force of this craft work looks like, the next is, how do organizations really get there? Well, I think that the most important thing is time to solve the problem. And so the more I've consulted in my career, the more I understand that the dynamics of capital structure is intimately related to time. And it depends on where the life cycle of a software product is, will tell you how much time you have to solve that problem itself. If you're just achieved a round of funding, maybe you have a lot of time to solve the problem. But the important thing is to understand the relationship between the problem and the time to solve the problem. We inside of the actual agile process, we spend so much time talking about estimations and commitments and accountability, which is a side effect of this, which is that oftentimes we don't know if we have the time to solve the problem before we start the attempt to solve the problem. And so I think that the first thing that organizations really need to figure out is, how do you get the time to solve the problem? Our fast-paced business world is always moving past the construct of time. The next and probably dearest to my heart is employer-based investments in education. That academia or traditional education will not be able to train the workforce as what we need to do changes so much. And so at Eighth Light, we have an apprenticeship program that kind of starts people's careers at Eighth Light. But I think that it's much bigger than that specific construct, that the education needs to move from more passive institutions into the organizations that have a feedback loop to the problems being solved and the innovation that's happening. And so I think that this is a massive shift that organizations need to do to be able to employ craft workers and be able to see them thrive. So how do we get there? Sustainable pace guidelines. So sustainable pace is one of those spots where consistency and consideration go up against each other, because we want to have this idea of sustainable pace where people can be in the state of stretched. But that state is different for each person. And so how do we as organizations balance consideration for the individual and consistency for the overall ecosystem that exists to be able to get this sustainable pace that we know of it, like the time to solve the problem. Craft work happens over long periods of time, and generally software is built over long periods of time, and it's a lot of knowledge understanding that creates the most value, not necessarily every piece of execution. And so I think that this sustainable pace guideline is so important, and you can kind of see that the Icarus and Daidaeus story play out of, we don't want somebody who's flying too close to the sun and then crashing. But we do want to go up and create that position of stretch and even feel some of that stress in that position of stretched for periods of time, and to be able to go down and really kind of re-energize for periods of time. And so I think that this is a place where I haven't seen a lot of definition around, and we'll get to that in a little bit, of how to solve this problem. The next is feedback without bias, and learning from the history of art and peer review. It's so incredibly important for peer critique, for groups of experts to be able to come together and describe each other's work. And we do this in pull requests. But it's when we get into the world of bias and judgment that these things start to go awry. And so I think that a chunk of what we have as organizations to be able to do is to be able to communicate in a shared language and in a shared mechanism to be able to provide these feedbacks. And right now, most of what I see is it depends on the individuals. We can do trainings here and there, but the individuals will be the ones who either bring this or don't bring this. So organizations also need to start thinking about a career journey without a career ladder. So there is obviously advancement and progress that happens throughout somebody's career, but if we're talking about generalism and specialism and a ever-changing marketplace of technology advancements, we can't really see that far ahead of us to what somebody's advancement is going to look like. It may go into a specialization that we don't see right now. We see like different technologies pop up. We see different adjacent disciplines that literally weren't disciplines in software 3 years ago. And so I think we need to start acknowledging that the career journey is very different than the traditional career ladder that, for example, a business management firm would say that you are an associate and then you move up to a consultant or a principal. And I don't think we have the language to describe when somebody is getting better as a generalist and when somebody is getting better as a specialist, and what the relationship between those two things are throughout the time of somebody's career. So here's another one, that organizations need to figure out how to match make people to problems. If we're talking about individuals being very different through their feedback mechanisms, through their T-shaped skill sets of specialists and generalists, that we need to be able to understand that the workforce is not as replaceable individual to individual as it has been in the past. You know, there's the old idea of like, I'm a Java programmer, or I do this one thing. I think that it's much more nuanced than that now to be able to acknowledge, like get this idea of productivity and engagement out of an individual. I think that most of those things end up being more of a matchmaking from the individual to the problem set than a lot of the environmental reasons that Mayo management went down. That it's a lot more the core than the edges. And we need to be able to reward curiosity and quality. This is a really difficult thing that is in the opposite of Taylor scientific management, because it's really hard to measure curiosity. It's hard to measure how the right question got asked that led us away from one solution and towards another. And it's also really hard to measure quality, because oftentimes quality happens over longer time spans that aren't necessarily reconcilable to where the quality came from to where the conclusion came from. So it's really difficult when we have quarterly or yearly reward cycles, whether it be, you know, the bucket of goods that an employer has in you know, salaries and bonuses. It's really hard to be able to measure these things, but we absolutely need them for this organizations of craft work to be successful. And so when we look at these things, we see that there on the left here is that the type of work is changing pretty significantly. The type of worker, this craft worker, is changing pretty significantly. And then the organizations need to be able to do a very different set of things than they have had to do under the, the conglomerates of the 80s, or moving into the versions of the startups of the 90s that were still able to look backwards to the management theory and management philosophy and say, okay, we'll at least structure the organizations like these traditional ways have been structured. And so I think that the underlying conclusion that I have is that care alone doesn't scale, but intentional systems must create the baseline. And so this is the Icarus and Daedalus story of flying close to the sun and down. We need to be able to lift the baseline and answer a lot of these questions of the organization on the right with systems to be able to create the environment that individual care and individual craft work can start to thrive inside of. And I think that, I originally intended to start putting some solutions out there, but the more and more that I researched this, the more it was clear to me that we need a new theory of management for craft work. There's really no way to put these things together of how the organizations are changing, how the marketplaces are changing, and where exactly the crafter fits inside of those changes. I can say from at Eighth Light, we take a lot of those organizational adoption. We try to do a lot of those, but oftentimes it feels like we're inventing something that is incoherent with a theory of management for craft work, that this is how we do things. This is how we can judge whether an apprenticeship program works or whether Google's 20% time works. It's really difficult for us to be able to put those things together without any coherent theory of management today. And thank you. That is the conclusion of care does not scale, but we need to figure out how to create this baseline and how to make the individual systems in place for people to be able to thrive.